I should never have looked at him. It was a cold night in Nevada, and I was driving home from work later than usual. The deserted highway cut through the desert like a dark scar, lit only by the headlights of my car and the distant glow of a motel sign blinking on the side of the road. My body was tired, my mind a jumble of confused thoughts. All I wanted to do was get home and sleep. But then I saw him, a tall man, standing on the side of the road, wearing an impeccable black suit. He was standing still, almost like a statue, staring straight at me. There shouldn't have been anyone there. This stretch of road was isolated, with no houses nearby. A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't see his face properly. The darkness of the night and the way his features seemed blurred, as if the very air around him were shaking, made it impossible for me to see any detail. My first instinct was not to stop, but as I passed him, something inside me forced me to look in the rearview mirror, and that's when I realized he was closer. My heart skipped a beat. The man hadn't moved. He couldn't have moved that fast. But now, he was just a few feet behind the car. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. I accelerated. That feeling of being watched consumed me. With each new glance in the mirror, he seemed closer. My mind screamed at me not to look anymore, but how could I not? It was as if he knew I was watching. And then, the car radio turned on by itself. Static filled the interior of the vehicle and a faint voice whispered through the hiss, "You've seen me. Now I can see you too." My lungs seized up. I tried to turn off the radio, but the buttons wouldn't respond. The light on the dashboard blinked. The car engine sputtered. And then, everything shut down at once. The car died in the middle of the road. I was alone, in the dark, and when I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was right behind the car. The man in the black suit had no face, just a thick shadow where his eyes, his mouth, his identity should have been. And then, he smiled, but not a normal smile. It was as if something had folded inside the darkness, creating a line of white teeth where there had been nothing before. The car door locked by itself. The radio hissed louder, and the man raised one of his hands. The reality around me distorted. Everything felt heavy. My vision went blank for a second, and then I was somewhere else. The asphalt disappeared. Now I was standing in an empty city with buildings I didn't recognize. The only thing that remained the same was him. The man in the black suit was still there. Now he was walking towards me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. And when he finally stopped in front of me, I felt something terrible. I had been there before, but I didn't remember. And then, he whispered inside my mind, "If you see me, it's because you already belong to me." My vision went dark, and I disappeared. Darkness swallowed me. There was no sound, no time, just absolute emptiness around me. My mind tried to process what had happened, but it was as if I were floating in nothingness. Then I felt it. He was still there, the man in the black suit. Even though I couldn't see him, I knew he was close. I could feel his presence curling around me, cold, heavy. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, reality returned. I was back in my car. The engine was running. The radio was playing a low, old-school song, something from the 50s. The road ahead of me was the same, but something was different. My hands shook as I touched the steering wheel. I looked around, trying to find some sign of what had just happened. The clock on the dashboard read 3:33 a.m. But the problem was, the last time I looked, it was still 11:45 p.m. Almost 4 hours had gone by. Panic tightened my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had fainted, maybe it was a stress attack. But then, I noticed the detail that made my blood run cold. The rearview mirror was turned down, as if someone had adjusted it. My throat went dry. I didn't touch the rearview mirror. My hands were still shaking as I slowly repositioned it. And that's when I saw it. He was in the back seat. My body froze. The silhouette of the man in the black suit took up almost all the space, his presence dense, impossible to ignore. My reflection in the mirror showed his face, or rather, the lack of one. Just a void, a black hole of pure absence, but he was smiling. White teeth peeked out from the darkness where his mouth should have been. And then, he whispered, "You shouldn't have looked at me." A scream caught in my throat. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I needed to get out of there. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing the car forward. But then, the road began to change. The streetlights flickered erratically. The signs along the way no longer had words, only strange symbols, like a language I couldn't understand. Reality was shattering around me. Then, a terrible sound filled the car. Static. The radio turned on by itself. The volume turned up to maximum. I tried to turn it off, but the buttons wouldn't respond. And through the static, a familiar voice whispered, "Come home, before he takes you forever." My heart nearly stopped. It was my voice. The radio was playing my own voice, but it was slurred and distorted. Panic gripped me. The car was shaking. The lights flickered again, and when I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was gone. But I knew. He hadn't gone away. He was inside me now. I drove without stopping until I reached my house. I didn't bother locking the car or turning off the lights. I just ran inside, slamming the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. Everything seemed normal. The clock on the wall read 4:04 a.m. The living room was the same as I'd left it, but something was wrong. The silence was too deep. I picked up my phone to check my messages, to see if anyone had called me while I was missing. No alerts, no notifications. But then, my phone vibrated in my hands. It was a message. No number, no ID, just a picture. My hand felt cold as I opened the picture. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed, but I hadn't gone to my room yet, so whatever was lying there, it wasn't me. The phone fell from my hand, and then, the light in my room turned off by itself. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone anymore. The man in the black suit had entered my house. My mind screamed to run away. But run away to where? I would never be alone again. Because now, he saw me, and once he saw you, he never left. I should never have bought that doll. It was a warm Sunday in rural Pennsylvania, and I had decided to spend the afternoon exploring a local antiques fair that took place once a month. I had always enjoyed these things. Old objects have stories, and I liked the feeling of bringing a piece of the past into my home. But that doll, it shouldn't have been there. I found it in a booth at the end of the fair, a dark corner where the lights were dim and the merchandise looked forgotten by time. The vendor was an elderly man with sunken eyes and a vacant expression, as if he had spent too many years dealing with things no one wanted. The doll sat on a wooden table, among old clocks and faded photographs. She was old, made of worn porcelain, with dull blonde hair and a lace dress that had turned yellow with age. But what caught my attention most were her glass eyes. Unlike any other doll I had ever seen, her eyes looked all too human. And the strangest thing, she wasn't for sale. At least that's what the man told me. "This one's not for sale," he muttered, not looking at me directly. "Then why is it on the table?" He hesitated. "Because she always comes back." I laughed, thinking it was just a trick to scare me, but he didn't laugh back. "Look, if you want to take it, take it. But don't say I didn't warn you." That should have been a sign for me to back off, but I was too intrigued. I offered him $20, and he accepted without arguing. When he handed me the doll, I noticed his hands were shaking. I left the fair without thinking much about it, but the moment I got in the car and put the doll in the passenger seat, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. My house was about 30 minutes away from the city. The sun was already starting to set on the horizon when I parked in the garage and took the doll inside. I placed it on a shelf in my office, among some old books and other small relics that I had collected over the years. I stared at it for a while. It looked different now. The glass eyes seemed to follow my movements, even though I knew it was just an illusion. I shrugged and turned off the office light. It was that very night that it all began. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The house was silent, too silent. I looked at the clock, 3:17 in the morning. My eyes were heavy, but a discomfort took over me completely. You know that feeling that someone is watching you? That was it. I turned over in bed, trying to shake off the paranoia, but then I heard a noise in the hallway. Low, a soft thud on the floor as if something small had fallen. My heart raced. I lay there, waiting to hear it again. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had knocked something off the shelf. But then I heard footsteps, small, slow footsteps, coming from the hallway toward my room. My chest tightened. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The bedroom door was ajar. The darkness of the hallway was thick, and yet I felt something was there. And then something ran past the door. My spine froze. My body froze. I saw it. For a split second, a small silhouette passed through the crack in the door, and I knew what it was. The doll. She was no longer in the office. The air grew heavy. Slowly, I got up from the bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I walked to the door, trying to ignore the growing fear inside me. I looked down the hallway, empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. I turned slowly toward the office. The door was ajar, and in the darkness, she was sitting on the shelf again. But now, her eyes were looking straight at me. My blood ran cold. My first reaction was to convince myself that I had left her there the whole time. But then, I noticed something that made me gasp. Her dress was covered in dust, as if she had been walking around the house. My mind screamed at me to get rid of it, but I had to be sure. I picked up the doll with shaking hands and carried it back to the shelf. I left her sitting in exactly the same position, and to make sure it wouldn't move, I did something that seemed silly, but that at that moment seemed necessary. I put some flour on the floor, around the shelf. If something moved it, I would see the tracks. So I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, my eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. The minutes passed, then an hour, then two. Absolute silence, until I heard a soft crack. My heart raced. I turned to the clock, 4:33 in the morning. The crack came from the office. I got up slowly. The fear was suffocating, but I had to look. I pushed open the bedroom door and walked down the hallway. The office door was open. My breathing became heavy. I turned on the light, and my blood ran cold. The doll was no longer on the shelf. I looked at the floor, the flour around the shelf. There were small footprints. My whole body shook. The footprints led all the way to the door, and then they stopped, as if something had disappeared into thin air. The only thing left on the shelf was a yellowed piece of paper, which I was absolutely certain had not been there before. I picked up the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. There was only one sentence written on it, in childish handwriting. "Why did you wake me up?" The doll did not want to be disturbed, and now she would not leave me alone anymore. The message trembled in my hands. Why did you wake me up? I wanted to believe it was a prank, that somehow my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw the flour on the floor. The small footprints were still there. I wasn't alone in that house. I picked the doll up from the floor, holding it tightly. The cold porcelain felt heavier than before, as if there was something inside it. It seemed to be watching me. The plan was simple: get rid of it immediately. I ran to the back door, determined to throw it away. But then, the lights in the house flickered, and the television in the living room turned on by itself. The screen showed only static. The sound stopped me in my tracks, a chill running down my spine. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it, the doll's reflection on the TV screen. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, her eyes were open. I turned around immediately, but the doll still had her eyes closed, or had been before. My heart raced. I ran to the backyard, and without thinking, threw the doll in the trash can. I slammed the lid and took a deep breath. This had to end. I went back inside. The silence hung heavy in the air. I turned off the TV and dimmed the lights, trying to calm my mind. It was just tiredness. It had to be. But as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, something made me stop. The back door was open. I was absolutely certain I had locked it. The butterflies in my stomach returned with a vengeance. Slowly, I walked to the door and looked outside. The night was still. No wind, no sound. But then, my eyes fell on the trash can. The lid was open. The doll was gone. Fear paralyzed me. I turned back into the house, my breathing becoming ragged. My whole body screamed at me not to look up. But when I finally looked up, she was at the top of the stairs, sitting down, staring right at me. My blood froze. My lungs seized up. Then, she fell backwards and began to crawl down the hallway on her own. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. That's when the upstairs light went out on its own, and in the darkness, I heard a childish laugh. Software coming from the hallway. That was too much. I turned and ran out the front door. I got into the car without thinking, locking the doors. My breath was coming in short pants, my eyes wide. I started the engine, but before I could accelerate, my heart stopped. In the passenger seat, the doll was sitting, and on the car window, a new message appeared, as if it had been written on the inside, the same childish handwriting. "You can't leave me." My scream echoed in the night, and in that moment, I knew I would never be free of her. I should never have gone into those woods. It was supposed to be just a trip with friends, a weekend camping trip in a remote location, far from the city, with no internet, no noise from cars, just nature and the stars. We chose a secluded spot in North Carolina, a forested area known as Black Hollow. None of us had heard of the place, but the photos online showed a perfect setting: tall trees, crystal clear streams, and miles of untouched trails. It seemed perfect, but there was something the photos didn't show, something no one talked about, until it was too late. There were 5 of us on that trip: me, Ryan, Ashley, Tom, and Eric. We arrived at the site just before sunset, parked our cars at the trailhead, and began hiking to the campsite. The plan was simple: spend the night in the woods, build a campfire, tell stories, and return the next morning. But as soon as we started the trail, I noticed something strange. The silence. No sound of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Ashley noticed it too. "It's a little too quiet, huh?" she commented, looking around. "Maybe the animals have already gone to sleep," Eric joked, trying to hide his discomfort. But I knew something was wrong. And then, it happened. The first voice. Weak. Low. "Jake." I stopped in my tracks. The blood ran cold in my veins. It was my name. Someone had called it from the darkness of the forest. But when I looked at the others, I realized that no one else had heard. I swallowed hard. "What's wrong?" Tom asked, noticing my expression. I could have told him. I could have told him what I heard, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I just shook my head. "Nothing. I thought I heard something," and I kept walking. But the voice, it was still there. We reached the campsite and set up our tents. The campfire was lit, and before long we were talking and laughing, trying to ignore the fact that the forest was still eerily quiet. But I couldn't forget what I had heard. I couldn't ignore that voice. And then, around midnight, it came back. "Jake." My spine stiffened. But this time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. Ashley looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Everyone went silent. Eric laughed nervously. "It was probably the wind." But there was no wind, and that voice, it was human, it was close, and the worst part, it sounded like me, my own name, spoken in my own voice. Ryan wiped away his smile. "I think we should go to sleep." Everyone agreed, but I knew no one would sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange cold. The fire had already gone out, and everything around me was too dark. But it wasn't the cold that woke me. It was the sound of footsteps, right outside my tent, small, shuffled, my breath caught in my throat. I stood still, listening to the sound get closer, and then stop right at the entrance to the tent. The zipper started to move. My lungs froze. The fabric slowly opened. I knew it wasn't one of my friends. They would never do that in the middle of the night. So, who was it? My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight beside me. Counting to 3 in my mind, I turned the light directly to the opening of the tent, and I saw it. Small, bare legs, pale skin, soiled with dirt. I didn't recognize that person. But then, she ran. I heard the quick footsteps on the earth, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I jumped out of the tent, shining the flashlight in all directions. Who's there? The wind blew, and then all my friends came out of the tents at the same time. Their faces were pale. Terror was etched in their eyes. Ryan swallowed hard. Did you hear it too? Silence was the answer. Ashley looked at me. Someone's here. I knew she was right. The problem was, they knew we were here too, and they weren't alone. The silence around us was thick, heavy. We were all outside our tents, holding flashlights, our eyes wide. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we knew the truth. There was something in the woods, and it wasn't an animal. Ashley held my arm tightly. Her face was pale. Jake, someone called you earlier, didn't they? I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to confirm what everyone already suspected. But then, the voices came back, low, cold, calling our names. Ryan, Ashley, Tom, Eric, and then, even lower, almost inside my head, Jake. My skin crawled all over. Ryan swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But we knew something was there. Ashley took a step back. We need to get out of here, Eric agreed. Let's go back to the cars now. But when we started to gather our things, we realized the worst. The trails were gone. Where there had once been a path through the woods, there was now only thick vegetation. It was impossible. We knew where we had come from, but now the forest seemed to have changed, as if the environment itself was trapping us. Tom looked around desperately. This doesn't make sense. The path was here before. Ryan tried to remain calm. Okay, we'll follow the stars. We just need to keep walking east and we'll reach the road. Ashley pointed up. What if there are no stars? I swallowed hard. The sky was completely dark. There was no moon. There was nothing, just pitch black. And then, the footsteps came again. The sound came from all sides. Light, small footsteps, like children were running around us. Eric held the flashlight tightly. Who's there? No answer. But then, something ran through the trees. We saw only a figure, small, pale, and when we pointed our flashlights, there was nothing there. My heart raced. Ashley held my arm even tighter. We need to get out of here, now. No one argued. We just started walking. With each step we took, the forest seemed to change. The trees seemed taller. The mist that had been gone before now covered the ground. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, we saw the first figure up close. It was standing between the trees, small, with its back to us. It looked like a child, but something was wrong. Its arms were too long. Her feet were bare on the cold ground. And then, she turned her head back, but her body didn't move. My lungs seized up. Her eyes were black and sunken with nothing inside. And then, she smiled. Her mouth widened as if her skin was tearing. Ashley screamed. We all ran. We ran aimlessly, just trying to get out of there. The forest seemed endless. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, no matter where we ran, we always saw a new silhouette standing between the trees, sometimes close, sometimes far. They were watching us. They knew our names, and they were having fun with us. Ryan tripped and fell. When I turned to help him, I saw something moving in the fog behind him. Small hands came out of the ground, trying to grab his feet. He kicked desperately, and we pulled him up. But it was too late. His eyes were glazed over, as if he had seen something he shouldn't have. "We shouldn't have come here," he murmured. I already knew that, but now it was too late. We kept walking, faster and faster, more and more desperate. The forest closed in around us, and then we saw it, the exit, or what seemed to be it, an open trail in the middle of the fog. Ryan and Tom ran ahead. Ashley looked me in the eye. "If this is a trick, we have no choice." She nodded, and we ran together, our hearts racing, our lungs burning. The sound of voices behind us grew louder, and then we crossed the trail. I stumbled and fell to the ground. The cold was still in my chest, but the sun was rising. We could hear birds singing, the normal sounds of the forest. Eric fell beside me, panting. We left. Tom and Ryan were in shock. Ashley was shaking, her eyes wide, but we saw no one else in the forest. No children, no silhouettes, no sounds, nothing. We were on the other side of the trail, back at the parking lot, but something was wrong. My chest still hurt. I slowly stood up. The car was there, the same car we had left before we went in. But then, as we got closer, we saw it. The car window was fogged up, and written there, in childish writing, was a message. "We can still see you." My breath hitched, and when I looked at Ashley, she was staring into the rearview mirror of the car. Her lips were trembling. I turned slowly and saw, in the reflection of the glass, behind us, in the middle of the forest, there was a line of eyeless children, smiling, and then, like shadows, they disappeared. But we knew the truth. The calling forest never lets anyone leave completely, and sooner or later, they would come for us. I should never have stayed at that hotel. My trip to Louisiana was for work, not a vacation or fun. Just another small town, another boring meeting, and a night in some cheap hotel before catching my flight home. The plan was simple, but nothing that night went as planned. I arrived late, almost 11 at night. The hotel was in the center of town, an old 3-story building with a worn facade. The neon sign flickered erratically, as if it were struggling to stay lit. The name, Hotel Bellevue. I had never heard of it, but it was the only one available in that area. As I walked in, I noticed that the lobby was empty. No guests, no one at the front desk. Just an old clock on the wall, showing 11:07 at night, and the muffled sound of a radio playing old music somewhere in the building. I rang the front desk bell. Silence. I rang again. After a few seconds, an elderly man appeared, wearing an old receptionist uniform. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes. Name's Jake Coleman." He nodded, picked up a paper book, yes, no computers, and leafed through it slowly until he found my name. Room 405, top floor. I took the key and thanked him, but before I went up, I asked a question that I didn't even understand why I asked. "Is the hotel empty today?" The receptionist stopped, his dark eyes fixed on mine for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Number, you just haven't heard them yet." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I just nodded and headed for the elevator. The elevator was old. The cabin shook slightly as it ascended, and the lights flickered every time it passed from one floor to the next. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, a cold wind came from the hallway. The atmosphere here was different. The walls had a yellowish tint, as if no one had painted them in decades. The old carpet creaked under my feet, and the smell of mold was strong. But the worst was the silence, the feeling that someone was watching me. My room was 405 at the end of the hallway. As I walked, I noticed that the doors to the other rooms didn't have numbers, just old, worn signs. But when I passed room 403, something made me stop. The sound of whispering came from inside, low, faint, as if someone was talking on the other side of the door. My heart raced, but as I got closer, The whispering stopped. I swallowed hard and continued walking to my room. Room 405 was small and simple. A double bed, a dresser, an old mirror in the corner, and a tiny bathroom. I threw my suitcase on the floor, took off my shoes, and threw myself on the bed. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that the place gave me. Maybe it was just tiredness. Maybe. But then I heard it again. Whispers. This time, inside my room. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the mirror. I slowly turned and looked at the mirror in the corner of the room. The surface seemed distorted, as if something was on the other side. But then, the light bulb flickered, and for a brief second, I saw a face in the mirror, pale, deep-set eyes, just watching me. My throat went dry. I blinked and the face disappeared. But the whispers, they didn't stop. I tried to ignore them. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and took a deep breath. It's just tiredness. But when I looked up, the bathroom door was open, and I was absolutely sure I had closed it. Fear crept up my spine. Something was in the room with me. I walked out of the bathroom slowly and looked around. The bed was the same, the mirror unchanged. But then I felt something moving in the hallway outside. I got close to the door and looked through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. Room 403 had its door open now, and in the hallway, a silhouette standing still, small, leaning against the open door, looking in my direction. The hallway light flickered, and then the silhouette disappeared. My lungs seized. Instinct screamed to get out of there immediately. But before I could do anything, the room phone rang, slow, shrill. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. I walked over to the phone with a shaking hand and answered it. Hello? Silence, and then whispers, low, faint, but this time I understood what they were saying. You're in the wrong room. The phone hung up on its own. The temperature dropped. I knew what that meant. Someone, or something, was waiting on the other side of the door, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer alone in that room. The phone hung up on its own. The silence in the room was suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. You're in the wrong room. The words echoed in my mind. What did that mean? And more importantly, who had called me? My palms were sweating as I looked around the room. Something was wrong. The room felt different, as if the furniture had been moved a few inches. But that wasn't all. There was a strange smell in the air, Moldavian wet earth. And then I heard it, the voices again, low, cold. He shouldn't be here. He needs to leave. It's too late now. My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from inside the walls. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control my breathing. Then I turned to the door. I had to get out of there. I gripped the doorknob tightly and turned it. Nothing. The door didn't open. I locked and unlocked the lock. Still nothing. My stomach churned. I was trapped. I stepped away from the door and picked up the phone to call the front desk. No signal. The phone was dead. Sweat dripped down my forehead. It was then that I heard a new sound, coming from the hallway. Footsteps, slow, heavy. They were rhythmic, like someone was approaching my door. My muscles locked. The shadow appeared in the crack of the door. Someone was standing on the other side. The doorknob moved. Once, twice. My body was paralyzed with fear. Then, a knock. Then another, and another. The door shook. I stepped further away, feeling the air grow colder. Then, out of nowhere, silence returned. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. The only sound was my own heavy breathing. I took a deep breath, and then I gathered my courage. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. My stomach churned. The hallway looked different. The lights flickered slowly. The old carpet now looked worn and covered in dust. And at the end of the hallway, The door to room 403 was still open, but now I could see what was inside. It was too dark, as if the light itself didn't enter that room. And then I saw something coming out of it, a small silhouette, walking slowly. My heart raced. That wasn't human. The way she moved, her light steps, it was like she was floating. My instinct screamed to move away, but before I could react, she looked straight at me. My body froze. Her eyes were black, sunken, lifeless. And then a whisper came through the door, low, cold. "You shouldn't have come here." My lungs failed. The shadow disappeared, but something told me she was now inside my room. I needed to get out of there. I ran to the window, but we were on the 4th floor. There was no way I could jump. I went back to the door and tried the lock again. This time, it opened. The hallway was now normal. The lights were on. The carpet was old, but clean. And what about room 403? The door was closed again. There was no one there. Everything seemed normal, but I knew the truth. Nothing was normal. I grabbed my suitcase on an impulse and left the room, closing the door behind me. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist was still there, sitting at the counter, as if he had never moved. He looked at me without surprise. "Problem with the room, Mr. Coleman?" My mouth was dry. "What happened upstairs?" He studied me for a moment, then smiled slightly. "You got the wrong room." My chest tightened. "What do you mean by that?" He didn't answer. He just slid a new ledger across the counter and pointed to a page. My eyes widened when I saw what was written. My name wasn't on the guest list, but someone with my last name was. Coleman, 1954. I swallowed hard. This must be a mistake. The desk clerk just kept smiling. Maybe. At this point, I didn't want any more answers. I just wanted to get out of there. I threw a $20 bill on the counter and walked out the door, not looking back. I got in my car and sped away from that damn hotel. But as I drove, a thought gnawed at me. If I was in the wrong room, who was in the right room that night? And worst of all, who was still waiting for me inside? I should never have gone back to that place. The playground from my childhood was still there, abandoned, rusted, lost in the middle of a forgotten suburb in Ohio. They say that after the accident, no one had the courage to renovate it. I wasn't sure if I believed those stories, but after that night, I knew the truth. I went back to the city for my mother's funeral. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it was necessary. The old neighborhood where I grew up looked even more run down than I remembered. Houses with broken windows, empty streets, a heavy silence in the air, and in the middle of it all, the playground. I hadn't planned on driving by it, but as I drove down that deserted street, my eyes were drawn to it. The swings were still there, creaking slightly in the wind. The metal slide was covered in rust, the merry-go-round, still, as if waiting for someone. But the worst, the old spring horse, still there, waiting. The last time I saw him, he was covered in blood. When I was 8, a boy died on that playground. No one knows exactly how it happened, but he was playing on the spring horse when something happened. My mother never told me the details. She would only say, "Never go there at night, ever." And that night, I broke that rule. I parked the car and got out. The cold wind bit my skin, but I kept walking, as if something was pulling me there. The playground was exactly as I remembered it, but the silence around it, it was wrong. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just the creaking of the empty swings. And then, I heard it. Children's laughter, low, almost imperceptible. My spine froze. I turned my head back. Nothing. But I knew what I had heard. I knew. I took a few more steps into the playground. The soft sand ground gave way beneath my feet. And then, the swing moved on its own. I stopped dead in my tracks. The wind was cold, yes, but not strong enough to rock just one of the swings. I approached slowly. The creaking was loud, annoying, like a warning. That's when I saw it. The footprints in the sand, small footsteps, leading to the swing, but there was no one there, and that was when I heard my name. Jake. My blood ran cold. The sound came from behind me. I turned around in a rush, my heart pounding. Nothing. But then, the spring-loaded horse started moving on its own. My legs felt heavy, but I knew I had to run. Something was watching me. The air around me turned cold. The merry-go-round began to creak, turning slowly, but there was no one there. Then, the laughter returned, and now, it was coming from all sides. "Jake, let's play." My breath caught. I ran to the car without looking back. I opened the door and got in, locking everything. My heart was beating so hard I thought I was going to pass out. The silence returned, but before I started the engine, something made me look in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A pale child sitting on the swing, staring at me, and then she smiled and disappeared. That night I realized something. The playground was never abandoned, and now they know I'm back. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. I wanted to believe it wasn't real. But when I closed my eyes that night, all I could see was the smile of the child on the swing. I should have left town first thing in the morning, but something made me go back to the playground, and that's when everything got worse. The day was cloudy when I parked near the playground again. I didn't even know why I was there, but I needed to be sure. The wind blew slowly, making the swings creak. The place seemed colder, more dead. I heard my own heart beating as I took my first step onto the sand. This time I paid attention to the details. The merry-go-round was still standing in the same place. The slide was covered in rust, and the spring horse. It was turned toward me, as if it knew I was coming back. I swallowed hard and looked down at the sand, and then I realized footprints, small bare feet marking the sand, heading toward the spring horse. I wanted to back away. I wanted to run away. But before I could react, I heard the first laugh. My whole body froze. The sound came from the slide. I turned my head slowly. The slide seemed empty, but I felt it. Someone was there. The sand beneath it was marked with footprints. And then I heard it. The voice, low, whispered, "Wanna play?" My lungs seized up. The slide was empty. But then I saw something moving in the sand. The footprints formed on their own, as if something invisible was walking toward me. The wind picked up. The merry-go-round started spinning on its own. The spring-loaded horse squeaked, and then the sand shifted, as if something was crawling underneath it. I ran. My mind screamed that this was impossible, but as I ran back to the car, I felt something touching my leg, cold, small, as if a child's hands were trying to hold me down. I jumped into the car and slammed the door. My breathing was ragged. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The playground looked normal, but I knew they were still there. And then I saw something written on the car window, in tiny letters, as if a child had used their fingers to draw in the dust. "Don't go away." I didn't sleep that night. I tried to ignore it. I tried to pretend it hadn't happened. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt the cold air inside the room, and I saw it. The window was open, and on the glass, the same message as before, written again, but this time in a more desperate tone. "Don't go away." Then I heard the creak, low, slow, coming from inside the room. I knew what it was. I knew, because I had heard that sound before. It was the sound of a spring-loaded horse moving by itself. My body froze, and when I turned around, I saw it, the doll. A doll sitting in the corner of the room, in a faded blue dress, cracked porcelain, and with a smile that was too wide. The same doll I remembered from the playground when I was a child. I had never brought it home, but now it was there, and I knew what it meant. The playground didn't want me to leave, and now it had followed me.